Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sharon Bonney. I'm the CEO for the Coalition on Adult Basic Education. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today, Be Prepared, Understanding what the New Immigration Public Charge Rule Means for Adult Educators. And this webinar is wondrously sponsored by Burlington English. They've been a real friend and a partner to COABE, and they've made this webinar free of charge to our members. So I'd like to turn this over to Robert Breitbard of Burlington English. Robert?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you. We always try to take a time to say thank you to Sharon and to all the Bonnies and to COABE, but if there was ever a time, it was now. I'm just going to share my screen just for a real quick minute here, and I just want to say thank you to all for joining in. If you haven't seen, Amanda and Gabrielle, I think you're in for, a really highly engaging and informative, your time very well spent today. So thank you very much for joining in. If you're new to Burlington, or if you haven't seen Burlington in a while, or maybe if you use Burlington but used an older version that originally needed a download, just know that we've got an entirely new set of Burlington English, an entirely new 2.0 Burlington Core, and it is perfect. It's fully web-based, accessible on every device, from smartphone, tablets, anything that our learners have in their households. And I think the greatest thing is that it provides everything that myself as a teacher, if I am web connected, virtually connected with my learners in a synchronous, live, engaging environment, everything that I would need to fill up the screen and have my entire class participate, everything that I would need, a year's worth of projectable lessons right there. We call them our in-class lessons. And then, best yet, it's matched seamlessly to everything students are going to do when they're learning on their own in an asynchronous environment. If you'd like any more information about some of this, you should also know that we have products that cover all ranges of the NRS 6 levels. If you happen to be in a CASA state, we're official preparation course from the ESL side for prepare for CASAS. So when the dust clears and we're back to measurable skill gains and actually able to assess learners, just know that the work your teachers are doing now will lead to, really all the best successful gains you can imagine. And with that, please visit our website, because when you visit burlingtonenglish.com right now, you'll see a pop-up box, and that will allow you, we're literally doing up to 80, 90 live interactive webinars a day, half hour, hour. And again, if you just visit our website, you'll quickly go to our 5 steps planning webinar that we're doing, as well as the highlights of using Burlington at a distance. So in a half hour's time, you can see all the top elements of Burlington to give your teachers everything they need. And then whether you're using Adobe Connect, WebEx, whatever, we're doing general best practices for teaching in a virtual environment. And all of these are complimentary, free of charge, and they're done literally. We're serving hundreds and hundreds of folks each and every day, all free. Just go to our website at burlingtonenglish.com. So with that, big thanks to all of you out there. If you're not COABE members already, I sure hope you are. And Sharon, you should know we're keeping our eye on a much better day when we're able to, see everybody at a COABE conference soon. So thank you, everybody. And I'll turn it back over to Sharon and to our great panelists today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. We truly appreciate your sponsorship. And, Burlington English has been such a partner, and we're really grateful for the support you've provided. So I'd like to take just a quick minute here to talk about some additional support that we need, but this time from you in the field. We, as you are likely aware, held our Capitol Hill Day on April 8th, and we held that virtually because of COVID-19. It was really successful, and we want to continue that advocacy effort. So we're continuing it through the month of April. We're calling it Advocacy April. And as you're likely aware, many of our teachers and administrators are really struggling, both trying to ramp up their classroom to an online classroom, and also because the adult learners, many of them don't have Wi-Fi, don't have laptops, are really pulled in multiple directions from home. And so our goal is to get some funding to help deal with some of these challenges. So as you're likely aware, we were originally going after the usual about $692 million for the WIOA funding, but we have a few more asks in there now. So we have the $1 billion for COVID federal funding. And, to be entirely honest with you, we don't feel that this is something we will get, but we feel that when you shoot high, then you have a chance of getting a little bit more. And our goal is to get some funding for the field from the federal, from the government. So that's one ask that we have out there. And then, as you're likely aware, we also have the $32 billion COVID-19 stimulus funding. And what that is the third stimulus package that was passed. The emergency education relief funding was sent directly to governors and state legislators. So there's the state block grants, and you really have to contact your governor to even request funding for adult education because it's not written in there. So we want to make sure it is, and we need every voice out there. We need everybody taking action. So you'll see, if you look in the chat box, I've placed a link in there where you can take action, where you can contact your legislator. It's just 3 quick clicks. It's super easy to do, and it's a really great way to help the field. And I just want to make the point too that none of this funding comes to COABE. There's nothing in this for us other than helping the field. This really goes directly from the government to either the governors or to the state directors of adult education. And as you all are likely aware, working together, we staved off hundreds of millions of dollars of funding cuts in the past and added 75 million already. So our goal really is to continue that incline upwards and to get the help for our members that we desperately need. I also wanted to mention that in terms of COVID-19, we realize there's a lot of needs out there for our teachers and administrators. And so we put together a series of webinars. This actually was planned before COVID-19, but the webinar we had yesterday, we had almost 700 people on. The webinar we have in 2 days, there's about 1,000 people registered. So I just wanted to read these off real quickly so you're aware. Bridging access to COVID-19, information among adult learners was one. Best practices for teaching online, student engagement in online learning, teaching digital literacy standards using a new app-based course, and considerations when implementing distance learning. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, please look in the chat box because I also placed the link to sign up for these webinars in there. So that's that. Well, I am going to the next slide here. I would like you all, if you could just tell us where you're dialing in from, put your name and your location right there in the chat box. But when you have questions, you're going to want to put them in the Q&A. And maybe you can help us bring a nice warm greeting to Amanda Berkson-Shilcock and Gabrielle Lassard. So I'm going to read their bios real quickly here. So Gabrielle specializes in the laws and policies affecting access to health care for low-income immigrants and their families. She's an active member of the California Health for All Coalition and the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign. Gabrielle's work includes writing articles and policy analysis, providing technical assistance, and presenting trainings to legal and social service providers, government agencies, legislative staff, and community-based organizations. That's Gabrielle. And then Amanda Berkson-Shilcock, as Senior Fellow, Amanda leads National Skills Coalition's work on adult education and workforce policies that support U.S.-born and immigrant adults with foundational skills gaps. In this role, she analyzes policies, makes recommendations, and coordinates with National Skills Coalition member organizations to address issues facing adult learners and job seekers, including immigrant workers. I also just want to mention that Amanda has been a wonderful partner to COABE. She's done a few webinars for us before, and they've always just been excellent. And I just want to thank you, Amanda, for the work that you're doing in the field, because I've had the chance to work with you directly, and it's been a true pleasure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to these ladies, and I'll be off screen.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Really appreciate the opportunity to be joining you all today. I just want to note on a technical note, I've seen that many of you are having trouble being able to use the chat box. It's disabled, and so Sharon and her team will troubleshoot that at their end. We're sorry about that minor technical glitch, but we will make sure that those links that Sharon was talking about for Advocacy April and for the COABE webinar series are enabled in the chat box so that you can access those. I want to thank everybody who made the time to hop on today's meeting. I know we're all becoming Zoom experts now if we weren't already. And it's a challenging time. I know folks are teaching from home, sometimes homeschooling their own children from home, juggling new distance learning. And we really appreciate that you took some time in the midst of all that's going on in the world to join us here today. I want to thank Sharon and COABE for making the time to schedule this webinar, and really more importantly, for bringing the field together in advocacy. We are hearing two really interesting things in our conversations on Capitol Hill right now. The first is that Congress is newly aware of the importance of digital literacy for people of all backgrounds and at all skill levels. And the second is that most of Congress is not familiar with the role that adult education plays in helping people build digital literacy skills. And that's why the advocacy that COABE helps to lead and the advocacy that all of you do from your organizations is so important. If there's ever been a time to help Congress see why investments in adult education are important for our broader economy, this is a perfect time to make that illustration. So I encourage you, if you're not already doing so, to make sure that you're sharing with your members of Congress how your organization is handling the switch to distance learning and how you're helping people build digital skills, both in your own teachers and your own staff, as well as among your adult learners. So our conversation today is going to focus in particular on immigrants. And before I get into that, I'm going to switch over in just a minute to the slides on my screen, and Gabrielle and I will turn off our cameras while those slides go ahead and go up. But what I wanted to acknowledge was that there are a lot of folks listening today from all over the country, and in particular, I just wanted to call out, I know we have pretty strong representation today from Alaska, and that means you all got up pretty early to be able to join us. So thank you so much for doing that. We're happy to have you all with us and happy to be sharing this information with you. Two other logistical notes. The first, you will get these slides via email to you later this week, so don't worry about having to hustle to take notes quickly. You will have the slides to refer back to, and of course the recording will also be posted on COABE's website. And then secondly, I just wanted to note that we are happy to take your questions in the Q&A box at any point if you'd like to go ahead and submit them. Again, we are, for those of you who've just submitted notes in the Q&A about the chat box issue, we are working on that and making sure that it's not disabled for you all going forward. However, if you do have questions for us as presenters, we do ask that you use the Q&A function to submit those. Okay, great. Well, without further ado, I'd like to get into the substance of today's conversation. So we're talking about understanding what the new immigration public charge rule means for adult educators. So there's been a lot of publicity about the public charge rule, and we're going to talk through what that actually means and what its implications are for you in the classroom. Gabrielle and I will be switching back and forth. So I am an adult education and immigrant integration specialist at the National Skills Coalition. I serve as a senior fellow. We are a Washington, D.C. based organization. I encourage you to follow us on social media and sign up for our free newsletter. We do a lot of advocacy on the Hill and in the states around adult education. Gabrielle is based at the nonprofit National Immigration Law Center, which has offices on both coasts. She's based in Los Angeles. NILC, which is how the National Immigration Law Center is known, also has an office in Washington, D.C. Gabrielle is an attorney and an expert on public benefits issues as they pertain to immigrants. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to give you kind of a grounding in what is the public charge, not in the weeds, not trying to make you all immigration lawyers, because that's not a good use of your time, but really just giving you enough substance so that you have some confidence that you can reassure your learners who might be feeling overwhelmed or scared about rumors they've heard or about how they think this public charge regulation might affect them. Then we're going to talk in particular about kind of what are the adult education implications of the public charge. So after Gabrielle does her piece of the presentation, it'll come back to me and we'll kind of talk through, well, what does it mean for you as an educator? If you're running a program, if you're at a community college, if you're at a community-based nonprofit, if you work on a worksite program, what do you really need to know in order to be able to serve your learners the best? And then we'll take your questions if they haven't already been answered by our presentation. So I do want to flag, and Gabrielle will come back to this in her presentation, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services has recently made a policy update about the COVID-19 pandemic. So all of the information we're giving you today about the public charge is true now, and it will be true over the longer term. There's also been a little piece of good news with regard to the COVID epidemic and immigrants' use of certain services as part of the COVID epidemic, and I'll let Gabrielle give you the details on that. So again, you'll have these slides to refer back to. No need to hustle to take notes, but we're going to walk you through some key overview pieces of information to start with. So what the heck is the public charge? Not really a term that rolls off your tongue. Might not be one that you had heard of a lot before the last year. It is a new federal regulation. It took effect back in February. In general, it makes it more difficult for immigrants who are applying for lawful permanent resident status. And the common name for LPR status is green card, right? I need to get my green card. I want to get my green card. There's a number of other ripple effects in the public charge regulation, and we'll talk about what those are. But this is the big picture, right? The big picture is it's a federal regulation. It's already in effect. So even though there are still court cases going on about the regulation, it has taken effect, and it does make it more difficult for your immigrant learners to get a green card. What's more concerning is even more important than the actual effect of the regulation, which might discourage immigrants from accessing a wide range of services, is the chilling effect, right? Things that people are afraid to do, even though in reality they are allowed to do them, and the regulation hasn't changed that. And the reason I'm emphasizing this here, and you're going to hear us say this 3 or 4 times over the next 40 minutes, is adult education and English classes can help immigrants, not hurt them in the public charge test. So attending your adult ed classes is never going to hurt your immigrant learners, right? You can feel absolutely confident in reassuring them that attending adult education classes is not going to count against them in the public charge test. So Gabrielle will be kind of walking through the details of that, but I just want to emphasize it because we see there's a lot of chilling effect of people being fearful that, oh, well, if your class is paid for out of a government grant and I come to your class, might that hurt me? Might that count against me? And the answer is absolutely not, right? You can feel free to reassure your adult learners about that. So in our overview today, we're really going to talk about the adult education implications of the public charge. If you're somebody who works for a big multi-service agency, maybe you have healthcare services or nutrition services or other kinds of services that you offer to your immigrant clients, you might have questions about those too. And Gabrielle's organization is co-leading in a national initiative called Protecting Immigrant Families, and they have a whole wealth of free resources on their website that will help you dig into those health and nutrition and other questions that you might have. So we've put the link here. We've also put a resources link in the last slide of today's presentation. I've already given you this bottom line, but again, education and workforce really only help immigrants in their green card applications, not hurt them. Okay, I'm going to turn things over now to Gabrielle, and she will walk you through kind of a public charge 101. And as I turn it over to her, she's going to give you a little background on the National Immigration Law Center, which is the nonprofit where she works.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks to everybody for your interest and participation. Just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A box, and a note that before people started posting that they couldn't access the chat, there was a question for Robert all the way at the top of the queue. So again, I work for NILC, the National Immigration Law Center. We're headquartered in Los Angeles. We have a DC office. We also have people working from home all over the country right now because we had to expand so fast in recent years. Amanda, can you go forward 2 slides, please? So we don't practice immigration law. Our mission is actually to defend and advance the rights and opportunities of low-income immigrants and their family members. And we use 3 integrated strategies, which are policy analysis and advocacy, impact litigation, and strategic communication. So our focus today is on public charge. Public charge is actually a very old part of federal immigration law dating back to the 1800s. A public charge is a person who's dependent on the government for support. A person who is deemed to be likely to become a public charge in the future can be denied permission to come to the U.S. That's obviously somebody who is at an embassy or consular office abroad applying to come to the U.S., or lawful permanent resident status, also called a green card, which a person can be applying for either inside or outside of the United States. This is called the public charge grounds of inadmissibility. The federal immigration law has a number of different reasons why a person could be deemed inadmissible. Next slide. So there are 2 federal agencies that recently updated their public charge regulations, or recently promulgated new public charge regulations. The first is the State Department. The State Department policies apply to those people who are applying for a visa to come to the United States. That can be either an immigrant or a non-immigrant visa. There are a number of people who are exempt from public charge and they don't have to pass through that process at any point. But these regulations are executed by consular offices around the world. They went into effect on February 24th, 2020. The second set of regulations comes from the Department of Homeland Security, specifically U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services within the department. If you have been tracking this issue over the last couple of years, these were the regulations that a number of people submitted comments about. So these are the regulations that apply to people who are applying for permission to enter the country. You can be here first before you do that, or for lawful permanent resident status inside the United States. And again, that's processed in USCIS offices, often called application assistance centers. Both sets of regulations went into effect on February 24th. They use very similar, effectively the same standards and definitions in determining whether a person is a public charge or is likely to become a public charge. Next slide. So again, not everyone is subject to public charge. This is one of the few bright line tests that remains. Public charge primarily affects family-based immigrants, people who are being sponsored by a family member. There are a number of exemptions. Generally, people who are admitted to the U.S. for humanitarian reasons are exempted from public charge. So some of these categories include refugees, asylees, people who are applying for or who have T visas as survivors of trafficking, people who are applying for or who have U visas as survivors of other serious crimes, several different categories of domestic violence survivors, including people who are petitioning for themselves under the Violence Against Women Act, and special immigrant juveniles who are children who have been abused to the point of being deemed to be abandoned or who have actually been abandoned. Next slide. Okay, so one thing that's important to know, public charge is assessed, again, when a person is applying to come to the U.S. or applying for that green card. The last step between getting on the pathway to becoming a citizen is getting that green card. Once a person has their permanent resident status and they're applying to become a naturalized citizen, there is not a public charge test at that point in the process. Next slide. So how the public charge test works. It's a complex multi-factor test. Immigration officials will look at this on a case-by-case basis, and it is an inherently subjective assessment. Again, it's forward-looking. Officials are looking at whether a person is likely to become a public charge at some point in the future based on their current circumstances. So it's what we call a totality of circumstances test. That's just a way that lawyers say all the facts, and it looks at both positive and negative factors. Within the statute, it actually requires officials to consider specific factors that include the person's age, health, income and financial resources, skills and work experience, and within these regulations, it also adds the person's proficiency in English. Next slide. So negative factors in the public charge test, and these are some examples that we pulled out of the regulations, are having a household income below 125% of the U.S. federal poverty level, having been diagnosed with a health condition that could require extensive care in the future or interfere with the person's ability to work, having less than a high school degree or the equivalent, and again, not being proficient in English. Next slide. Apologize that my cats are playing. Another factor in the public charge test, and it's really important to note that this is actually not the primary focus of the public charge test, even though when people think about public charge, they think about it in terms of not using public benefits. Immigrants' use of certain public benefits can count as a negative factor in the totality of circumstances. It's actually just considered as one aspect of the income and financial status element. So the benefits that can be considered under the public charge test are cash assistance that is intended for income maintenance, meaning the person's day-to-day living expenses from any level of government. So federal, state, local, if you have county general relief program in your county, anything that's intended as cash for the person to live off of, that is a negative factor. And that includes TANF and SSI as well as general assistance. Federally matched Medicaid with exceptions for coverage for emergency services, coverage for children and young people up to 21 years of age, and coverage for women who are pregnant, including 60 days of services after the end of the pregnancy. Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which was formerly food stamps, some people call it EBT, and then certain forms of housing assistance, specifically federally funded public housing, Section 8 housing vouchers, and Section 8 project-based rental assistance, which is usually provided to nonprofit housing developers to help them make their properties affordable. Next slide. Now, it's important to keep in mind, can you go back one, Amanda? It's important to keep in mind that people who are subject to the public charge test are rarely eligible for the public benefits that count as negative factors in the public charge assessment. If you're familiar with the eligibility rules for immigrants' access to public benefits, people who are permanent residents generally have to wait 5 years before they can get benefits. And then people who are eligible without that 5-year waiting period generally fall into the humanitarian exceptions to public charge. So really the concern about using public benefits is far greater than the reality of someone potentially having that counted as a negative factor. The only benefits that count against people are those that are specifically named in the regulation that were listed on the previous slide. State and local non-cash benefits do not count. Benefits used by someone else in your household do not count. We hear all the time about people taking their children out of Medicaid, and it's tragic and unnecessary because children's use of Medicaid is exempt, and if the children are not applying for immigration status themselves, their use of benefits would not be considered as a factor. But again, the public charge determination is about predicting whether a person is going to become dependent on the government in the future. And the test that's been put into effect under these regulations is linked to the person's use of these specific benefits in determining whether they are a public charge. So even if a person has used these benefits in the past, if their circumstances have changed in a way that they're not going to need benefits in the future, including that they got additional education that has made them more employable, then that is not going, those factors will not be weighted as heavily against them. Next slide. So Amanda mentioned that there was some specific guidance about COVID-19. On March 13th, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services announced that the agency would not consider as a negative factor in the public charge test testing, treatment, or preventive care, including a vaccine if one became available, that were related to COVID-19, even if those services were paid for by Medicaid or another public benefit that was included in the rule. Their announcement also said that if a person needed to use public benefits because of COVID-19 related factors, including having been furloughed from a workplace that was closed or having had a school shut down, then that person could provide an explanation, and that would be presumably a mitigating factor in their totality of circumstances test. Next slide. Okay, so how is the public charge test implemented? U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, again, part of the Department of Homeland Security, has created a new form. It's Form I94, the Declaration of Self-Sufficiency. The State Department has created its own new form, the DS-5540 Public Charge Questionnaire. These forms are filed for people who are not exempt at the same time as their application for a visa or for permanent resident status. These forms ask for a lot of information and documentation. They will be very burdensome for people to complete. Next slide. Okay, and then an important note about the use of benefits. I know that some of your institutions receive, for example, SNAP or TANF funding. Public charge would measure benefits that were given to the individual as the eligibility unit, not benefits that were provided to your institution and then the individual somehow benefited from by participating in a program. So enrolling in an education program that was funded by SNAP or TANF would not count against the person unless they have individually applied for public benefits. Next slide. Okay, so what is this? I'm going to hand this over to Amanda at this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabrielle, for that incredibly informative overview. I want to acknowledge a couple of things. First of all, I know folks are still having frustration with the chat box. Our apologies for that. And we are getting all of the messages that you are submitting in the Q&A, so thank you for submitting there. And thank you to all of the folks from all over the country who are joining us. We had more than 800 of you registered today. I've seen shout outs from Alabama, from Connecticut, from Nevada, from Michigan, from Oklahoma, really from across the country, and we're so grateful that all of you have made the time. A number of you have already submitted questions. We've answered a couple of those in text. We'll be answering more of them in real voice as this conversation continues. But please do go ahead and keep submitting in the Q&A box if other questions are emerging. I promise that if we don't have time to get to them all in today's conversation, Gabrielle and I will follow up and send Sharon the final answers so that she can include those with the slides when they're sent out to you. Just to reiterate, you will be getting slides from today, and the recording and the slides will be posted on the COABE website, so you don't have to frantically take notes. You will be getting all this information. You will be able to refer back to it. So you've gotten a lot of information from Gabrielle on what the public charge test actually is. It's this totality of circumstances test where the immigration officer adds up all the pros and all the cons and weighs them and tries to determine whether the person is likely to become a public charge on the federal government. What does this actually mean for adult educators? The most important thing is that we're going from an old bright line standard that used to exist for more than 2 decades to a much more complicated landscape. And that doesn't mean that you all need to become instant immigration law experts. In fact, we don't encourage that. That's really an impossible expectation for you or for your staff. What we do encourage is that you feel confident in making general reassurances to your students and learners about key aspects of the public charge and that you know where you can turn to get more specific advice. So we're going to talk about both of those points now. We do very clearly want to emphasize that you shouldn't be trying to provide legal advice to immigrants. So if people are trying to ask you questions about when should I submit my green card application, or how shall I handle this question that I'm trying to deal with, that's really something that a legal professional should answer, either a lawyer or what's called a BIA accredited representative. That is somebody who's been accredited by the Board of Immigration Appeals at the federal government, usually a person who works for a nonprofit agency like a Catholic Social Services or a Lutheran Immigration Services that does legal services. There is a list of those nonprofit legal services folks at the end of this PowerPoint. So if your organization does not provide legal services, we would absolutely not recommend that you try to get into that with your learners. Instead, we encourage you to refer to reputable nonprofit legal services providers. And again, we do have a list of those at the end of this PowerPoint. We do think, though, that you should be ready to answer general questions about public charge. And that's really what this webinar is supposed to do. So we expect also that as adult educators, you're going to start getting inquiries from students who are filling out that new form that Gabrielle mentioned, that I-944 form that they're going to have to submit along with their green card application. And the federal government's instructions for that form are posted publicly. Again, we've linked to both the form and the instructions in the resources page of this presentation. So you'll have that to refer back to. And that I-944 form asks them to submit transcripts and other documents that demonstrate their educational attainment, their occupational skills, and their English proficiency. Here's the part where you're an expert and the U.S. government in certain respects is not as much of an expert as you are, because whoever wrote this form did not have a background in adult education. And so the form sort of seems to assume that everyone would have kind of a transcript of their class participation. But you and I know that many adult education programs are not higher education institutions, right? They're not a community college that's necessarily issuing people a transcript. So one thing that we expect is going to happen is that your immigrant students, both the students who are currently in your classes, as well as students who may have been in your classes years ago, but are finally doing their green card applications now, may come back to you and say, hey, can I get a diploma? Can I get a certificate? Can I get some kind of transcript showing how many hours of English I attended or how many level gains in English I achieved? The federal government has not given a template for what kind of document your organization could issue. But the nonprofit Protecting Immigrant Families campaign has created a template. So we encourage you to use that template and customize it for your organization. Now, just to remind you, this is really a request you would be getting directly from your immigrant student, and you'd be giving the form directly to your immigrant student, and they would be submitting it with their green card application. So this doesn't get into any privacy concerns about, well, would I be revealing information about my students to any other entity? No, you're only giving this form to the student, and it refers to that person. So it's giving people information about themselves that they can then submit to the federal government. And what's valuable about doing this is all of these factors, more education, more job training, more credentials, more English, those help people in the public charge test. So the most useful thing that you can do as an educator is make sure that your students have as much ammunition as possible to be able to demonstrate to immigration officers all the skills that they have gained in your class. So we really wanted to kind of bring that point home. So be prepared. You'll certainly get these requests from current and past adult learners. And if your organization doesn't issue documents like this, we've also provided a template in the links to today's presentation that states that your organization doesn't issue such documents. And that can also be useful for your students to be able to submit to the federal government so that they understand that the student may have attended classes, but your organization is just not in the business of issuing transcripts or similar documentation. So we want you to reassure your learners. We want you to ensure that they know that pursuing education or training can really help their totality of circumstances. And now we'd really like to start digging into your questions. There have been fantastic questions submitted in the chat box. Thank you so much to so many of you who've submitted those. I do want to bring Gabrielle back into the conversation. We're going to go ahead and start answering some of your questions. If you have additional questions, this is a great time to submit them. So the first question, Gabrielle, is whether parents who have multiple children might be counted more negatively in the public charge test for any reason. Can you talk a little bit about family size and how that counts in the public charge test?
So for those of you who aren't familiar with the federal poverty level standard, the amount of money that you need to be at a certain threshold is increased by the number of people in your household. So that, you know, if you had a 4-person household, you would need more money to be at 125% of the federal poverty level. So a family that has more children or that just has more people in the household is going to need to have more money to avoid being treated negatively for not hitting that income threshold.
Great, thank you so much. We also had a question from Carrie Chan who asked, you mentioned that the public charge rule does not apply for those seeking to become a citizen. What about for people who are renewing their green cards? That is not applying for a green card, but renewing it.
That is a common question. So lawful permanent resident status actually does not expire when your green card expires. It's only the card itself. So when you are renewing your green card, there is not going to be a public charge assessment. Likewise, there is not a public charge assessment for a person who's adjusting their status through marriage and initially receives a conditional green card. When they apply to have those conditions removed, there is not a public charge assessment. There was a question I answered earlier that I wanted to come back to, that I answered in the Q&A box, which is, we said it's not a negative for a person to participate in adult education programs that are funded by TANF or SNAP. Is it a positive? Yes. Getting additional education is one of the most effective ways that a person can improve their totality of circumstances. So particularly with respect to proficiency in English, getting a GED or some other high school equivalency credential, really important and some, you know, sort of the best thing that people can do for themselves.
That's great. A couple of other questions that have come in, Gabrielle, that I wanted to make sure that we got to. One set of questions pertains again to something a little beyond the scope of ESL classes, but Carol Hill is asking, would federally funded free meal benefits for our students be included in the public charge rule?
No, the only food and nutrition benefits that are included are SNAP, that a person would apply for individual, well, as a household, with eligibility based upon the household income.
Great. That's really helpful information to have. We also have a question about whether students who receive Section 8 help or SNAP or Medicaid would automatically be considered public charge and be denied a green card, or how does that work? So if you can clarify the kind of how does it work in terms of weighing the pros and cons.
Right. Okay. So public charge is a totality of circumstances test that looks at whether the person is likely to become dependent on the government in the future based on all of their current circumstances. So, you know, let's say that the student is young, the student is getting an education that's going to help them work. Yes, their use of public benefits would be factored negatively in that test, but it's a balance of factors. So if it looks like they are not going to need those benefits in the future, then they would not automatically be considered a public charge.
That is really helpful information, and I know that's kind of a nuance that it's hard to get from news articles, and why it's so important that you're here today, Gabrielle, to walk us through that.
And again, a reminder again that most people who are going to be subject to public charge are not eligible for these benefits. One question that's come up a few times, what about cash benefits due to COVID-19? So this is the COVID-19 relief packages. There have been 3. Those are a combination of tax credits and unemployment benefits. Both of those things are considered to have been earned, and they are not public benefits for purposes of the public charge test.
That is really important information, and I just want to hear you reiterate it, because we have another question from Elizabeth Delala, who said, I just want to clarify that a current green card holder cannot be penalized for accepting unemployment benefits. Is that true?
That's true. That's true for 2 reasons. One is that they have already successfully overcome the public charge test to get that green card. Secondly, unemployment is never considered as a negative in the public charge test. It's considered to be something that you have earned through your employment.
That is so important, and thank you, Gabrielle, for clarifying that. I want to answer 2 questions that are very quick and easy. The first, Catalina Riqueñez asked, is there a PDF flyer for adult students that we can share with instructors with general information on the public charge? Yes. There is a 2-page fact sheet that National Skills Coalition produced specifically for adult educators, and we'll make sure that everybody gets that in the documents that Sharon is sending out along with the slides from today. And then there's a whole series of really easy to understand and useful resources on the Protecting Immigrant Families website that Gabrielle's organization co-presents, and that's protectingimmigrantfamilies.org. So again, we'll make sure you get that simple 2-page fact sheet for adult educators, and you can also check out Protecting Immigrant Families. So there's 2 questions here. I'm sorry, Gabrielle, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, one thing that's come up a couple times is how people's English proficiency will be assessed, whether there's a standard. There is not a standard, and there's not a standard for measuring English proficiency, and there's not a process for measuring it. There are a number of things that were not spelled out fully in these regulations, and that is one of the reasons why there are a number of lawsuits challenging them.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. For those of us who work in WIOA-funded adult education programs, that is, programs that receive federal Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Title II funding, either through your state Department of Education or sometimes through your state Department of Labor. The federal government for those programs has ways that people are supposed to measure English skill gain. None of those ways were included in the immigration documentation for public charge. And so when I said earlier that you all are experts in some things that were not considered in the immigration public charge forms, this is one of those things. So the system that you all know very well, the pre and post tests that you do, the national reporting system, the CASAS, the TABE, the BEST Plus, whatever assessments you may be using, those were not spelled out in the form. We've had several questions about whether the template for allowing nonprofit agencies to show what participation an adult learner has had in your classes is available. Yes, it is a free template. It is available. We have linked to it in the resources slide at the end of today's presentation. You will also be getting all of the slides from today's presentation. Gabrielle, I want to go to one more narrow question and then a more complicated question. So the narrow question is the new Form I94 for new green card applicants only, or does it also apply if you're renewing your green card?
The I-944 is only for people who have submitted their applications for a green card on or after February 24th. Again, permanent resident status does not expire. It's only the card that expires. So there is no public charge test at the time that the person goes to renew their green card.
Right. That's such an important point, and I'm glad that you mentioned it. So we now have a slightly more complicated question. If a non-resident has all her children born in the U.S., are they able to receive SNAP only for the children without repercussions in her application for a green card?
Yes. Benefits that are received by other people in your household, even if they're your children, do not count against you.
Great. That is such an important point, and I'm really glad we were able to emphasize it. So there's another big picture question here around whether what we see as kind of the long-term potential for this regulation. So I just want to clarify, Elizabeth Kimball is asking, what do you see as the future of this law? Do you think there's a possibility it could be rolled back under a new administration? I just want to clarify, this is not actually a law in the sense that Congress did not pass new legislation. This is a regulation, which means a federal agency, in this case, the Department of Homeland Security, published it as a regulation and then finalized it as a regulation. Given that caveat, Gabrielle, can you talk a little bit about what the prospects are for potentially rolling back or overturning this regulation?
The regulations could be completely reversed by a new administration. They could also be stopped by the courts sooner than that. For those of you who have been tracking this, there are cases in at least 4 federal circuits, including 3 brought by my organization, challenging these regulations. Yesterday, the Attorney General of New York filed a petition with the Supreme Court to ask them to reconsider their decision, which had allowed the regulations to go into effect, because with the reason for the reconsideration being the COVID-19 pandemic and the effect that people have had, or the effect the regulations have had on people's willingness to use healthcare and other services. So it could be stopped any day.
Great, that's very important for folks to know. So we have a whole bunch of additional questions, and I really appreciate that folks are being so thoughtful and are thinking this through so carefully. We're not going to be able to get to all of them today. We'll get to as many as we can in the next few minutes, but we will follow up, and Gabrielle and I will submit answers to Sharon that she can mail out to folks with the slides. I want to do 2 last things before we turn things back over to Sharon to wrap us up here. Gabrielle, we have a number of questions that are really sort of boiling down to how can we help our students demonstrate that they've gained skills, that they're learning skills? How can we help our students prove sort of more pro factors on the pro and con part of the public charge test? And I'm wondering if you can just reiterate, what you were saying before about the importance of how the immigration officer is going to kind of weigh the pros and cons.
So again, it's a balancing test. They're looking at, based on all of the facts, whether the person is likely to become dependent on the government in the future. the regulations specifically name having less than a high school equivalent and not being proficient in English as negative factors, but any credential education beyond a high school degree, license, certificate, anything like that can be submitted with the I-944 and used to establish a positive, even a transcript. So to the extent that your organization doesn't normally provide certificates, that would be one thing that you could affirmatively create to help people have a better outcome.
Great. And I have just now put up on screen the resources slide. All of the orange links here in the resources slide are live links. So not this moment on the Zoom call, but when you get these slides in email, you'll be able to click on the orange links and go directly to the website. You'll get to see the I-944 form that your students will be filling out when they submit their green card application. You'll get that state-by-state list of free and low-cost immigration legal services. You'll get the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign, which has some nice overviews. You'll get the overview of the public charge risk estimator tool, which is coming from an organization called Boundless Immigration. And then you'll also get the Google Drive link to the blank template form that your organization can use to respond to those documentation requests that your students may have, which is how can I prove in my public charge test that I have improved my English or participated in job training. So we're coming to the end of our time here. I want to turn things back over to Sharon. Again, we'll be sending out the slides to you. We'll be following up with all of you whose questions we didn't have time to get to today. We are so appreciative that all of you took this time and that you had so many good and thoughtful questions. And we will be back in touch soon. Sharon, it's over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I've asked folks to complete a short poll to let us know how they felt the webinar went. So that's up on the screen right now. And also, I just want to take a moment to see if Robert Breitbart is on, if you'd like to share a few closing sentiments as well as a sponsor for this webinar. Robert?
Everyone, I couldn't imagine I've participated in webinars for years and years. Thank you for COABE, thank you for Sharon's work, but this was probably one of the most critical ones I've done in years. So on behalf of all of us at Burlington English, we thank our wonderful panelists. Thank again, one more time, if you're not a COABE member, I visit the COABE website all the time. Thank you for the hard work of COABE. BurlingtonEnglish.com. Would love to help you out and get your teachers and students connected. Thank you, everybody. Stay healthy out there. Thank you, Sharon. Be well.
Thank you, Robert. So thank you, Amanda and Gabrielle. We greatly appreciated your expertise and wisdom on this webinar. And thank you to all of you, our members, who took the time to join us today. So we hope to see you on the next webinar, which will be on Thursday. That webinar is specifically regarding, let me just say here, this is the one that has to do with COVID-19. So this is going to be hosted by American Institute for Research. And you will see the link for registering in the chat box. Thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you next time. Bye now.